And like, so.
Everybody ready? All right, I'd like to call to order the March 17th special meeting we've got for 2015. Would you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And Mr. Cahill Ridge, would you mind lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Well, welcome. We've got a lot on the agenda tonight. We'll get going here pretty quickly. The first item is the Sound Transit publication of the draft EIS for the Federal Link extension. And we're going to have a presentation from Sound Transit representatives Chelsea Levy and Cahill Ridge, then citizen comment for up to 3 minutes, and then per person, and then council discussion or questions. Then we'll move on to the briefing or study level of service that we will go on to. Then we've got an executive session after that. With that, Ms. Levy, welcome.
Hi, Mayor and Council. Thanks for having us back again this evening. As you mentioned, the bulk of our conversation is really going to focus tonight about the ST2 approved Federal Way Link Extension project, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you very briefly about some agency-wide planning efforts that are happening, somewhat related to Federal Way Link Extension in terms of funding, but I think it's just important for you to be aware that this is happening in the background as we're working on this ST2 project. So the Sound Transit Board is looking out into the future, Sound Transit's future. The Puget Sound Regional Council anticipates that by 2040 there will be an additional 1 million people in our region, and so the board reasonably and understandably is looking at how we might plan regional transit services to serve all of those new 1 million people. So we've taken some steps, and we are in the process of taking another series of steps to answer some questions about the future of regional transit. The first step was this past December 2014, the board adopted an updated long-range plan. The long-range plan for Sound Transit is a lot like a city's comprehensive plan. It's the region's vision for regional transit. And so with that new plan adopted, or updated plan adopted, we kind of have the framework for additional regional transit services and capital investments established. So the next steps that we're taking in terms of the future look for regional transit are listed here, and I want to talk about them very briefly in just a little bit more detail. So right now we're down, as you may be aware, in the state legislature asking for additional revenue authority. This is because the Sound Transit Board has instructed staff to take the steps necessary to prepare the agency to go back to the voters for approval of an ST2 package as soon as November 2016. The board hasn't said that we will seek voter approval or go with an ST3 package in November 2016, but they're essentially asking us to do the steps necessary so that they have that option when the time comes to make that decision. So the first step there is new revenue authority from the state legislature. This is our proposal. So it's a combination of sales tax, motor vehicle excise tax, and property tax that we're asking for. And you know, those conversations are of course very political, and this proposal is kind of working its way through the legislature as currently as part of the transportation package that was passed out of the Senate and is now being discussed in the House. So simultaneous to this legislative request, we've begun developing the agency's system plan. The system plan is essentially the process by which we'll identify the projects that will go into an ST3 package. So this is kind of a lengthy 1.5 year long system planning process, and we are at step 1 where that red star is right there. But through this process, we will work with jurisdictions and communities to identify the projects to be funded in a future potential ST3 ballot measure. So that's really what I wanted to make you aware of tonight. And unless there are any questions, I think I'm just going to hand it right over to Cathal, and we'll talk about the ST2 approved Federal Way link extension. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea, Mayor Farrell, members of the council. The draft EIS for the Federal Way link extension, we've been working on it for quite some time, as you know. We expect it will be published next month, early next month is what we're shooting for. And today I want to give you a kind of preview of some of the highlights of the document. Once we publish the document, there will be a 45-day public comment period. So that will go through from April through to end of May. And during that time period, we'll have public hearings where members of the public can come in and learn a lot more about the project. We'll also be sending out a mailer to everyone who lives within a half mile of the project corridor, which has a lot of information in it about alternatives and impacts, and also has a comment form in it. We'll also have a website that will be underway. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities coming up to learn more about what's in the draft EIS document. But as I said, I wanted to kind of give you a heads up on it today so that you're letting this stuff percolate over the next while until the comment period starts. So briefly, a project overview. You're familiar with many of these slides before. If you look on the left side of this graphic, you see the overall project corridor extending from Angle Lake Station, which is currently in construction and expected to open next year. And we're looking at alignments along 99 and along I-5 with stations in the Kent Des Moines, 272nd and Federal Way Transit Center areas. We're also looking at potential additional stations at 216th and at 260th on SR99. Those were not in the ST2 voter approved plan, but they did emerge during the environmental process from public comment. We have the opportunity to cross over from SR99 to I-5 in the Highline College area, so that's an alternative that I'll describe to you in a little more detail in a few minutes. If you look at the sections in the middle of the page there, I wanted to highlight some things to you. You're probably familiar with this corridor. Varies in width along the alignments. In the Kent Des Moines area, there's a very short distance between 99 and I-5. It's about a 1/4 mile separation there. As you get further south, it gets a little bit wider. 272nd area is about a 1/2 mile. And then down at the transit center where we are right now is more like 3/4 mile separation between the two corridors. So that's something to be aware of as you look at the corridor. The city boundaries are shown on the right of this graphic: SeaTac, Des Moines, Kent, and Federal Way. And you're familiar with city boundaries. They overlap each other a lot, and so that can really affect our alignment and station location decisions, because frequently these stations are on the border of 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 jurisdictions. And the profile along the bottom of this screen is just really to highlight that this is a very hilly topography down here, and so when you see the alternatives, which I'll describe in a minute, you'll notice that sometimes we're elevated, sometimes we're at grade, and sometimes we're in a trench. And that's not that the train is necessarily going up and down, but rather that the terrain that it's going through is rising and falling. brief review of where we are in the process. We started this back in the middle of 2012. We had a public comment period to get things started. We asked people what alternatives we should look at, what things they were concerned about. We spent about a year doing an alternatives analysis report, which looked at a whole range of alternatives, alignments, station locations. At the end of that year, we had another public comment period. We asked people to react to the information that was in front of them in terms of how those alternatives compared and help us identify what alternatives we should look at in more detail in the draft EIS. And in September of 2013, about a year and a half ago, the Sound Transit Board then identified, based on the public input and the analysis, what alternatives should be studied in the draft EIS. And for the last year and a half since then, we've been developing that draft EIS document, which, if you look towards the top of the second column, will be available very soon. We expect, like I said, early next month, a few weeks from now, we'll be publishing that draft EIS document. We'll then have a comment period that will last, as I said, for 45 days. We'll be asking for comment from everybody, city councils and members of the public. And then the analysis that's in the draft EIS and all of the public comment will inform what the Sound Transit Board identifies as a preferred alternative. Once they make that decision, we'll go ahead and do a final EIS document, which will be published middle of next year, and then a final board selection of a project to be built. After that, we're doing final design and construction. We expect to start revenue service to the Kent Des Moines area, which is the area that we've got anticipate having funding for at this point, by 2023. But we're doing the environmental approval all the way down to the Federal Transit Centre with the hope of getting additional funding from whatever source to allow that project to proceed as quickly as possible. We've done a lot of stakeholder outreach activities over the last couple of years. We've certainly been down on Federal Way a lot. Overall, we've had over 100 property owner meetings. We've had 5 public open houses, 45 community briefings, 40 neighbourhood drop-in sessions. We've had over 200 technical coordination meetings with city staff and key agencies along the corridor. We have a monthly interagency working group with key stakeholders in the corridor, including city staff. We have had 25 briefings to City Council, many of them here in Federal Way, and then we've had a number of briefings to our own Capital Committee and the Sound Transit Board. Some of the key concerns that we've heard repeatedly through all of this outreach are documented on the right side of this page. This doesn't capture every single comment, but some of the, the repeated themes that keep coming up. Minimizing impacts to commercial parcels, particularly along SR 99, that's a common theme that we hear a lot. Protecting the city's investments in the SR 909 right-of-way. As you know, Federal Way and other cities have made a lot of investments along SR 99, so concern about the impacts of an alignment along 99 on those investments. Minimizing view impacts along 99, and then construction impacts, not just the final configuration of these alignments, but what the impacts will be during construction of whatever alternative. And then on the right there you see allowing for the future 509 extension. That 509 project is not currently funded but may be funded soon, so we have to allow for that project to be built in the future. Locating the station close to Highline College is a common comment. Supporting transit-oriented development around the station areas, that's frequent comment as well. And then prioritizing speed and reliability with whatever alternative we might select is a key concern, particularly of course the Federal Way. And then, of course, facilitating parking and transit connections. That's something that we hear about repeatedly. So speaking to the alternatives, there are basically 4 alternatives, if you want to think of it. The first is along SR 99. It's shown on the graphic in front of you. The green line would generally be an elevated alternative in the median of SR 99, and it would switch to the east or the west side in the station areas. And then all of these yellow options you see are options, if you like. These could be alternatives that we might pursue to go down SR 99. So if you work your way down the corridor, you'll see first of all, you get to 216th Street at the north end of the corridor. That was identified as a potential additional station, not in ST2, but something that we got based on public comment early on. So there's an option to have a station there, and it could be on the east or west side of SR 99 at that location. If you move down a little bit south to the Kent Des Moines area, options 3, 4, 5, and 6 on this graphic, we could have a station on the west side of SR 99 at that location. We could have a station in the parking lot of Highline College, or we could have an option in the median of SR 99 or on the east side of SR 99. So lots of station options in the Kent Des Moines area. Moving a little further south to 260th, there's another potential additional station at that location. 272nd at the Redondo Park and Ride, there could be a station, and there's an elevated or a trench station option at that location. And then down in Federal Way, there could be a station right at the transit centre or to the west of the transit centre. So all of these options have been studied in the draft DIS. No, we haven't identified yet any particular alternative that is preferred, and that's the purpose of the upcoming comment period. The I-5 alternative would start, obviously, again at Angle Lake Station. It would swing over to I-5, utilizing the right-of-way, going along the south side of the right-of-way of the future 509 project, and then it would go along the west side of I-5. When you get down to the Kent Des Moines area, you could have an elevated station right adjacent to I-5, or you could have an at-grade station that's a little bit south of there, south of 240, behind the Lowe's, if you're familiar with the Lowe's property up there. Or we could have a station that swings in towards Highline College, so it would be on SR 99, and then swing back to I-5 and continue south along I-5 from there with a station at Star Lake Park and Ride. And then when you get down to the Transit Center, you could have a station at the Transit Center or to the east of the Transit Center in the Gateway Boulevard area, Parkway area, or we could also have a station at the 320th Park and Ride a bit further south. So those are all options that are on the table associated with an I-5 alternative. The third of the four basic alternatives is similar. It's kind of a combination of the previous two, starting on SR 99 and then transitioning over to I-5 in the Kent Des Moines area. Only difference really here is that transition. When you get down to Kent Des Moines Road, you would start to swing east towards I-5. You would have a station around 30th Avenue adjacent to Highline College, and then you would connect over to I-5 and continue south along I-5 from there. And then the fourth and final alternative is starting on I-5 and then swinging over to SR 99 in the Kent Des Moines area. Once again, a station on 30th Avenue, which is a dark blue line on this graphic. So those are the alternatives. You've seen them described in various ways before. And right now I'm going to present to you some of the results that we're seeing in the draft DIS document. So first of all, the SR 99 alternative, and what is represented by the graphic in the middle is a straight up SR 99 alternative that would be in the median of SR 99, generally speaking. No options here, just if you were to go straight down the median. Working your way around this clockwise, you start at the top with project cost. The overall cost of going from Angle Lake down to the Federal Way Transit Center would be about $1.77 billion. And if you look at the numbers below that, you can see how that compares to the other alternatives. The SR99 alternative is on the higher end of the cost for these four basic alternatives. It's the most expensive. Travel time would be very similar for all four alternatives, around 13, 14 minutes approximately. Daily ridership would be fairly similar for all of the alternatives, not much difference between the alternatives in terms of ridership. Land with TOD potential, that's transit-oriented development potential. That's looking at the areas around the various station options, the quarter-mile circle around those stations, and assessing which parcels within those station areas would have the potential to redevelop in the future. And if you're going with an SR99 alternative, you have a higher number than you would if you were going with some of the other alternatives. Business displacements, they would be higher, as you can see, on SR99 compared to the other alternatives. Residential displacements would be low if you go along SR99. And actually, most of those residential displacements are happening in the Kent Des Moines station area, where there's an apartment building and a mobile home park that would be affected by the station area itself. And then commercial land acquired would be greater if you're going with an SR99 alternative than with the other alternatives. You can also see some call-outs along the graphic, which if you've got a bit of time you can study, but it points out areas along the corridor where we might have visual impacts like at 216th or at 288th. And then also highlights some of the considerations with constructing an SR99 alternative. We'd have to do a lot of road reconstruction to make that alternative possible. There'd have to be lane closures during construction, and we'd have to move overhead power lines, things like that. A lot of utility infrastructure along there would have to be rebuilt if we're going down SR99. So moving to the I-5 alternative, you can see, I'll move through this a little bit quicker, but project cost-wise is on the lower end of the scale. It's the cheaper of the alternatives. Travel time and ridership are very similar. Land with TOD potential is a bit lower. You know, when you're over on I-5, you're losing that half of that station circle because of the freeway, so it scores a little lower on that measure. Business displacements obviously are lower with an I-5 alternative, not so much business along there. The residential displacements number, that's quite a high number. Most of that number is associated with a few apartment and condo buildings that are north of Kent Des Moines Road. If you're familiar with driving north on I-5 and you look to the west, you'll see those apartment buildings right north of Kent Des Moines Road. We would impact some of those apartment buildings if we're on I-5. There's no way to avoid them. So most of that is happening due to that impact, and also there's a couple of mobile home parks in the Kent Des Moines station area that be also affected. So that's where that is happening. It's worth noting that a lot of those displacements would also occur if the 509 project were implemented first. So it really depends which project is constructed first in terms of where the displacements occur. Commercial land acquired, obviously, it's less with an I-5 alternative. If you look at some of the call-outs in the middle, there's various particular impacts in different areas. But one of the big things with an I-5 alternative is that we've been removing trees along the side of the freeway to make that happen. Right now, if you're going down the freeway, you'll see trees along there. Some of those trees would have to be cut down to make way for the guideway. The third alternative, SR99 to I-5, you can see it's on the lower end of the project cost range. It's not quite as low as I-5, but it's down in that area. Travel time, ridership, fairly similar. Land with TOD potential is a bit better than an I-5 alternative. That 30th Avenue station is pretty good in the Kent Des Moines area in terms of TOD potential. Business displacements is on the lower end, and also residential displacements are also on the lower end. With this particular alternative, you avoid impacting those apartment and condo buildings north of Kent Des Moines Road, so that's why that number drops down a bit. And commercial land acquired is a little bit is towards the low end. And then the fourth of the four basic alternatives is the I-5 to SR99 alternative. You can see it's on the higher end of the cost measure. Travel time and ridership, once again, are fairly constant across alternatives. Land with TOD potential is higher with this alternative. You get that Kent Des Moines 30th Avenue station, which is good, but you also get that Redondo, 272nd Redondo station area, which is better than Star Lake in terms of potential development, redevelopment around the station area. Business displacements are high with this alternative, but interestingly, residential displacements are also high with this alternative because you're impacting the same properties north of Kent Des Moines Road. And it's on the higher end of the commercial land acquired measure. So those are the four basic alternatives. You also saw that we have options. I described some options. So this slide describes what the scenario would be if you had an SR99 alternative and you also added an additional station at 216. Now, as I mentioned before, that station was not in ST2, so this would require some sort of voter approval to add this station. It bumps up the cost. It doesn't have much effect on travel time. These numbers are rounded to the nearest minute. A very, very small bump in terms of ridership, but really you get a big bump in the land with TOD potential because you have 4 stations instead of 3 stations with this scenario. The other measures are fairly similar to the baseline. If you had an SR99 alternative with both a 216th and a 260th east station, as shown on this graphic, you can see what the impact would be. Cost would be a little bit higher than the baseline SR99 alternative. Ridership and travel time would be fairly similar, but now you've got 5 stations, so that land with TOD potential number is a lot better. The other measures are fairly similar. One interesting thing about this scenario is that you're really not affecting SR99 itself so much. You're generally, the actual roadway itself, you're generally on the east or west side of SR99, so you're impacting more commercial properties on the side of the street rather than being in the median. This is a scenario that shows the I-5 alternative, but instead of an elevated station at Kent Des Moines, you'd have an at-grade station, and this would be behind the lows. It really saves a lot of money. It's about $100 million less costly with this configuration. The other measures are fairly similar to the baseline alternative. And then another I-5 alternative is with a Kent Des Moines SR99 East station. So this is the configuration where you would be on an I-5, but you would swing over to have the station in close proximity to Highline College and then swing back to I-5. You can see that it increases the cost of the I-5 alternative by about $20 million. Travel time and ridership are similar. Land with TOD potential is a bit better. That SR99 East station in Kent Des Moines is better. And then the other measures are fairly similar. And just a couple more. SR99 to I-5 with a potential additional station at 216th. You can see what that does. It increases the cost a little bit, but it also increases the land with TOD potential measure a little bit. And then finally, I-5 to SR99 with an additional station at 260th. Once again, it's on the higher end of the cost range, but it also gets a bit of a bump in terms of land with TOD potential. This slide is a summary of everything you've seen before, so don't worry if you can't absorb all of this in one go. It's really just summarizing everything you've seen before so that you can sit back and digest it for a little bit. The schematics at the top represent the alternatives that I just described to you. There's also references to the detailed pages in your booklet if you want to flick back and forth. The numbers themselves are the same as I described on the previous pages, but we've color-coded these a little bit. So those colors that are lighter in color are lower performing, not as good, and those squares, if you like, that are darker in color are higher performing. I just want to make a few observations about this, and there's a lot of observations you can make. But first of all, in terms of project cost, I've highlighted there some of the scenarios that are on the higher end and on the lower end. So if you look at these SR99 alternatives that have potential additional stations, it's not surprising they are on the higher end of the cost range, more in the $1.8 billion and above end-to-end cost. Whereas if you're along I-5 and you have an at-grade station at Kent Des Moines, you're really on the lower end of the spectrum, about $1.32 billion. That's $500 million difference. It's a big difference between alternatives. Not a lot of difference, as you can see, in terms of travel time, whether you're on 99 or I-5, it's very, very similar. And not a lot of difference in terms of ridership with either alignment. There is a difference with land with TOD potential. Once again, those alternatives that have potential additional stations, you've got more stations, you're going to have more TOD potential around those stations. Business displacements, generally those alternatives that are on 99 or have some component of them on SR99 are going to have more impact on existing businesses. Residential displacements, you can see on this graphic, those alternatives that have an I-5 component have more residential displacements. But once again, that's mostly happening in the Kent Des Moines station area. And then commercial land acquired, those numbers are generally higher for alternatives that are along SR99. I want to say a little bit about some of the terminus options. First of all, I'll talk about Kent Des Moines, then I'll talk about Federal Way. In the Kent Des Moines terminus station area, that's the part of the project that right now we anticipate we have funding to construct. You can see there are 9 possible station options. When you look at all the different alignments and scenarios, there are 9 different places where the station could be located in that quarter-mile area between 99 and I-5. They're color-coded on this graphic. Those alternatives in green are associated with an SR99 alignment. This is consistent with the color coding throughout this presentation. And then those alternatives that are on I-5 are shown in red. You can see that those SR99 alternatives, even if you're going as far as Kent Des Moines, tend to be on the higher end, sort of 530, 550 million to get down to Kent Des Moines area. Those alternatives associated with an I-5 alignment are a little bit lower, more in the $400 to $500 million range. And then you have those options in the middle. Ridership is better with those alternatives that are near SR99. Those that are near I-5 are lower. The only exception to that is number 7 there, which is the option that swings over to SR99 and swings back. The ridership would be, of course, same with the station on 99. And then land with TOD potential, you're really talking about those stations that are on SR99 or between SR99 and 30th Avenue. Those are the ones that offer the best TOD potential around them. You can see what's in our financial plan right now. And if you were to add an additional station at 2/16th, this would be additional money, another $80 million on top of these estimates. If you were to add a trench, and there's a trench option that would go from 2/16th to Highline College campus, that would add another $120 million on top of these cost estimates. So there's a lot to consider there. Looking towards Federal Way, which is of more probably interest to this group, there are, of course, several different station options down in Federal Way. I described them previously. If you look on the left here, if you were to come down SR99, you could have a station right at the transit center. Cost end-to-end, assuming no station options to the north, would be about $1.7 billion. If you were $1.77 billion. If you were to put the station a little closer to SR99, you'd reduce that cost a little bit. If you're on I-5, you can see the costs are generally lower across the board, but there is a bit of a difference. I mean, the station near the transit center about $1.42 billion. Close to I-5, it's a little bit less. If you got to go down to 320th, it's going to be more to get down there. A little word or two about our TOD assessment, Transit Oriented Development Assessment. This was an extensive analysis that was done in parallel with our draft EIS document. It will be available for review at the same time we publish the draft EIS. It's consistent with the Sound Transit TOD policy, and this is really the first project that's been implemented subsequent to adoption of that board policy. We looked at access, so all the different types of access to these different stations, and there are 21 station options when you total up all the different options that I've described to you tonight. So we'll look at pedestrian, auto, bike, and transit access to all of these 21 different station options. We're looking at the land use, existing land uses, planned land uses, and infrastructure around these different stations. We're looking at each station in terms of what type of market there might be in the future for development around the station areas, whether it's lodging, office, residential, retail, commercial opportunities. And then, as I said, land availability, and that's the measure that I was touching on throughout the presentation, where we looked at the quarter-mile circle around each of these 21 different stations. We looked at every single parcel within that quarter-mile area, and we assessed whether that parcel was likely to redevelop in the future, given what's on that parcel right now. Some parcels are vacant, and they would obviously have high redevelopment potential. Some have improvements that are low in value that would be likely to turn over. And then some parcels have improvements on them that are not likely to redevelop. There might be a school there might be a park there might be a single family area not likely to redevelop. So that's what goes into this analysis. If you look on the right, you see all of the station areas along the different corridors. We've color coded this so that those stations that are less supportive of TOD on our scale are lighter in color rather, and those that are more TOD supportive based on our analysis are darker in color. In the Kent Des Moines area there, you can see that those stations in the SR99 and 30th Avenue area scored higher. There's no real station anywhere in the corridor that got a really high score. Mostly they're in the moderate range, but they did score better than the stations that are closer to I-5, which were a bit lower on the scale. And similarly down in the transit center area, Federal Transit Center area, those alternatives near the transit center generally scored a bit higher than those near I-5. The detail of that is shown on the next page. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you're interested in how any given station scored in terms of access or land use or market support or land availability, some of the detail is there. And of course in the report itself, which will be available when we publish the draft EIS, there's a great deal more detail. So I just want to conclude by reminding all of you again and the public about the process from here forward. All of this will be presented in the draft EIS document, which will be available in a few weeks at the start of April. We'll have a 45-day public comment period. It's crucial that people engage during that public comment period. Whatever decision is made over the next while will be the alternative that ultimately will be here in the future. So this is the time to engage if you've got particular opinions about stations or alignment options. After that 45-day public comment period, which like I said will probably run through the end of May, we will go to the Sound Transit Board. We'll present all the analysis that you see here today. We'll also present all the comments that we received from the various jurisdictions and the public. And based on that, the Sound Transit Board will make its determination. It will identify a preferred alternative. That's not a final decision. We still do a final EIS document, and a final decision on a project to be built. It will be made later next year. Then we'll move forward with final design in 2017, construction starting in 2019, and then revenue service, at least to Kent Des Moines, by 2023. That concludes the presentation.
Cathal, just briefly, do you have a good idea of when the public comment period opens up in regard to an actual date?
I've got a good idea. I'm reluctant to say the precise date, but it's probably going to be early April.
Early April. Okay,
Early April.
That's all I'm looking for.
Yeah.
All right, Council, any questions, comments?
Yeah.
Oh, Councilmember Moore.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, and I know you're saying it, but I think because of how important this issue is, and because of the history with the voters and Sound Transit, obviously I would, continue to have more public input, more public involvement, because I know I saw one of the numbers as 5 public meetings, I think. So I want to see, I'd like to encourage more of that, and I know it takes a lot of resources, but that's the only thing that comes to mind. I know you guys have put a lot of work into this. I know you've been very thoughtful and sensitive to the concerns, but that's just my only thought for now. Thank you, Mayor.
If I may just follow up on that, just to put your mind at ease, I guess. We will be having 2 public hearings during that comment period. One of them will be in the Federal Way Community Center right here. Also at Highline College. The dates for those will probably be early May. We're working on the exact dates right now, and we'll be doing a lot of outreach to make people aware of that. We'll be sending out, as I said, these flyers to every single household within a half mile of any of these alternatives, so people should be getting these in the mail. Please don't just throw it out. Open it up. There's a lot of useful information in here. There's a comment card in here which you can scribble your comments on and send back to us right away. There's also references to our website there. Our website is going to have a visual simulation of all of the alternatives on it, so you can view that and learn about the different alternatives. There will also be opportunities to learn about the impacts and also to submit your comments online. We'll be presenting to the other city councils. We'll be doing a lot of community briefings, reaching out to chambers, and so it's going to be a very intense period of outreach for us. Our goal is to contact everybody who we've spoken with over the last couple of years and make them aware that this is the time to provide comments. And so hopefully you'll be seeing a lot of that when the actual document is published.
Councilmember Maloney?
Thank you. The presentation is phenomenal, and it's really easy to follow everything you're saying, so I really appreciate that. You guys have done a really great job. I continue to be concerned about a 99 alignment because of how it will impact our town center that we've been working on and spending quite a bit of energy and money on, and that we're forecasting a lot of private development for. So just to put that out there, it does concern me quite a bit. My personal preference would be the third alignment that you've got listed here. It seems in terms of ridership and costs and all of the other benefits and so forth. I mean, that's just kind of, to me, that for Federal Way, that makes a lot of sense. So just throwing that out there. But I will also communicate my preference during the public comments time. But I wanted to ask you, I was asked whether, a community member has asked me whether it's true, because she heard that Sound Transit is meeting with the property owners, and the concern is that she's hearing that Sound Transit is telling property owners they cannot sell their properties once they. No, that is not true. I wanted to confirm whether that was true. What is the statement?
No,
so it's not.
We have been meeting with property owners over the last several months. I think we first sent out our property owner letters back in October. The purpose of those meetings was to, so we've got, as you can see, many alternatives on the table right now, and none of them have been identified yet. We wanted to give property owners in particular that could be potentially affected. Now, when we say potentially affected, we mean that either they might be directly displaced, or maybe some little portion of their property might be touched by any one of these alternatives. We wanted to make them aware that this document is happening, that this work is happening, and make them aware that now is the time to engage and be aware of how these alternatives could affect their property, so that they have an opportunity to respond and get on the record. So we've really spent time sitting down with anybody who wanted to be briefed one-on-one, wherever they want to meet, and spend an hour or so walking them through the alternatives as they relate to their property, and so that they're well prepared to comment during this comment period. And that's the purpose of it. The second purpose of it is to explain to people what the acquisition process, what the process overall would be. The first thing, it's always a little bit of a, you notify people that their property might be impacted, and then they're very concerned because they're like, oh God, I got to leave right now.
Yeah.
Or, and that's not the case at all. First of all, we don't know which alternative will be affected, so we're notifying people on alternatives that, most of these alternatives won't move forward, right? Only one of them will move forward. So most of the people that we've reached out to will, after June, after a decision's made, we won't need to be talking to them necessarily any further. But some people will ultimately be affected, and we want to explain the timeline. This is not a situation where we're going to be displacing people next week. There's many years between now and when the project would actually be built and in operation, and we wanted to step them through what that process would be. And also we wanted to put people's concerns to rest. People want to know, am I going to be compensated? Which of course they will. We're obliged to provide compensation, just compensation for any impacts that we would have. And so just step through people and really make them more comfortable. We've tried very hard to, we've responded to anybody who's asked us for a meeting, and we've tried to reach out to those to remind them, of those who haven't responded to us, to remind them of it. And all the meetings that we've had, I think most people have felt that they were really helpful in terms of getting a better understanding of the overall process. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's something that it's a good opportunity for us to remind people that if you are a property owner and you think you're potentially affected or have been notified that you could be potentially affected, please reach out to us. You can access it on our website, or you can contact our outreach people who are actually right outside the door here for anybody who wants to talk to them. And we're happy to meet with them one-on-one to ask their questions.
Thank you very much.
Councilmember Honda, and then Councilmember Acevedos.
Thank you. Can you remind all of us and those watching TV tonight exactly what is being done at this point, what's paid for, and what you need taxpayer approval to pay?
Right. Well, there's a graphic somewhere at the back, at the start of the slide. So we have the project area extends from Angle Lake down to the Federal Transit Center. That's what we're studying right now. The first section from Angle Lake to Kent Des Moines, or rather from Angle Lake to 272nd was what was identified in the ST2 plan, 272nd Street. That's what we anticipated being able to construct pre-recession. With the recession, we had to cut back on what was deemed affordable. So right now, we think we've got enough funding to get down to the Kent Des Moines area. So the first 2.5 miles of what is ultimately an 8-mile project. We're moving forward with the environmental approval. I know that you know this, but it's good to clarify for those who haven't heard this before. We're trying to get the environmental process behind us for the entire corridor. If you can get that environmental approval in place, it puts you at the top of the list for any new funding that might emerge, and that new funding could be an ST3 package, or it could be federal grant monies, or some other source. And that was really the reason for expanding the scope of the environmental analysis beyond what we actually have the money right now to construct.
So at this point, it will only go to the Kent area, and we need additional funding to get all the way down to Federal Way. That's what I wanted people to hear.
That's a lot more
Okay,
succinct.
thank you.
All right. Councilmember Acevedos, and then Councilmember Selsky, then Deputy Mayor Burbridge.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. My question then is, it sounds like it's going to be cost effective to go down I-5, right? To some extent.
It's less costly.
Less costly, yes.
Generally speaking, yes.
How about the timeline? Would that decrease how long it takes to go to do that alignment versus coming down
You mean
SR 99?
timeline for construction?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. It wouldn't be a big difference in terms of the time to construct. Really, what drives how long construction will take is largely based on when the money is available to construct, the cash flow when they're available. In terms of construction complexity, there would be, it is more complex to construct on SR 99, but the overall construction period would be fairly similar.
Even with the purchase and of all the lands and acquisitions?
More or less. To the extent that we have that detail right now, I would say it's pretty similar in terms of the construction period.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Councilmember Selsky.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Cahill and Chelsea, for the presentation. This is indeed a lot to digest. But I have a question. So there are 7 factors: project cost, travel time, it seems like we're evaluating here, or that are being evaluated. Is there any factor, according to the board or anyone else, that carries a higher weight than the other factors?
So firstly, I point out that these are the 7 factors that I chose to put into this presentation to summarize what is an enormous environmental document of thousands of pages. And it's to give you a preview, a high-level overview. The draft DIS document itself looks at literally hundreds of factors, lots of different environmental impacts, and is it's a very robust analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But to give you a snapshot, that's what I chose to put in here. But if you don't see some issues perhaps that are of concern to you, whether it's traffic impacts or noise impacts or other things, all of that is in the draft DIS document. And when we do have our public hearings, you'll be able to talk to our technical staff to dive into those issues that are perhaps not captured in this presentation, but you do want to understand about. So that's the first point. The second point, in terms of which is more important, there is no weighting system that we apply to this. We simply present all of this information for what it is. The weighting really comes, it's in the eye of the beholder and what they think is more important, and that will differ for different people. So I can't tell you what the most important thing
Okay,
is.
so there's no decision criteria that
There's
is
no-
more
There's no formula.
heavier. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. And Deputy Mayor Burbridge.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Cahill and Chelsea. And I would say this is a very impressively done snapshot, as you call it. There's so much information here, and it's very easy to utilize, I would say. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is related to the mailing that you mentioned that would go to people within a half mile. And is that 1/2 mile of any of the alternatives and stations?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it's outside of, if you look at the 99-95 corridor, we basically took a half mile
Right.
beyond that. It totals to about 26,000 different households that we'll be sending this document to. Not everyone can go to public hearings, and not everyone is necessarily even aware of the project yet, although we've tried to make people aware. Hopefully this will give them what they need, and it's nicely, compactly put together that you can get up to speed fairly quickly, even just by reading this, and it would point you to where you can get more information. So.
Okay, thank you. And then additionally, I'm wondering if we could put a link to Sound Transit's information on our website. So
Yes,
we
we've been
could,
actually
make it
working with your
easy for
staff
people.
on
Good.
that as well.
Good.
To get a little graphic, which will be similar to this graphic here. That's kind of our identifier right now, and then it links directly to the Soundtrans website. That'll be in place when we publish. Is the intention.
Okay, and any information on our friends to the south, Pierce County? Any work being done down there?
In terms of future studies, extending them there, Chelsea, do you want to talk about that at all?
So, yes, but not at the same level. So, last year we did a series of high capacity transit corridor studies, HCT studies, and our long range planning group looked at the connection from Federal Way to Tacoma. And so they came up with some very, very high level analysis, not at all to this detail, in a much shorter time frame. About different potential alternatives and very, very high level cost estimates. But on the books eventually for the extension further south will be an environmental analysis much like this one. We are not funded to do that yet though. So.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. What would be the cost differential should the State Department of Transportation takes the land or condemns the land for the 509 extension? What would be the cost savings for the I-5 alignment?
Right now, we're assuming in these cost estimates that whatever WashDOT land that we use, we would pay for. So that there is an arrangement right now where there's many situations throughout our region where we're using some WashDOT land or they're using some Sound Transit land. So there could be some trading of land, if you like, rather than actual exchange of money. But right now, this assumes that we would purchase that I-5 property, and it's included in the cost estimate.
Even if DOT has it, there would not be that
Right.
savings.
Yeah.
Interesting. Councilmember Maloney? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Council, any other questions? All right. Cahill, Chelsea, thank you very much. Great presentation. I wanted to ask right now if there's any public comment or anybody member of the public would like to say a few words about this issue. Going once. All right. Now let's move on to council discussion or questions. Council, any questions or additional comments? I wanted to make sure that obviously the reason why I was obviously asking about the timeline in regard to when the record opens, we may want to obviously put forth a resolution and work with area jurisdictions as well. So we'll be sure to get that calendared once it appears. So I would imagine probably the second meeting in April would be that opportunity. Councilmember Moore?
I assume we're still talking about the Sound Transit. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for the...
What our preference for alignment is.
Okay. I guess for me, in making that decision, one of the things I'm kind of curious about and during the presentation is, obviously there's been surveys and questions that have been asked of the public. Is there an opportunity for us as a council to kind of take a look at those feedback that's coming directly from our constituents?
Good question.
Yes, all of the comments that are made by the public are all part of the public record, will be part of the public record. And so when they're presented to the Sound Transit Board, they'll also be available for everyone else to review as well. That's the first point I guess I would make about it. You will also have an opportunity, of course, to attend the public hearings and engage with people who are making comments at the public hearings. And there will be, I'm sure, many other forums between now and then, in addition to our public hearings, where this topic will be discussed.
Okay. All right, council, anything else? All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. We'll be in touch, as they say. All right. Briefing now for study level of service for transportation. First, we'll have a staff presentation by Rick Perez, city traffic engineer.
Thank you and good evening. Actually, we've kind of integrated the two presentations into one, and it will be pretty obvious where the transition is. So, yeah, the issue we have with transportation level services, as we're working on the comprehensive plan, we are proposing a bit of a policy shift. But first off, how transportation level service is defined is pretty much letter grades, and they are measured differently for different facilities because people have different expectations about, you know, if I'm coming up to a stop sign, I don't expect to wait 2 minutes to get through. I might be a little bit more tolerant with a signalized intersection. And so these delay thresholds shown in these two columns are slightly different. Now, we also measure by volume to capacity ratio. That is, how much of the capacity of the roadway is actually being used by the volume. And our current level of service standard says we should keep everything within capacity. Why do we have a level of service standard? First off, it's required by the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act also requires transportation concurrency. It's actually one of the few hardcore rules in the Growth Management Act that says if we do not provide enough capacity for growth in development, then we have to deny that development. So it's one of the few things that actually has some teeth. So we have a level of service standard to plan for that growth. We use it in our project prioritization processes, and it also is used to determine the need to mitigate the impacts of development. So when the city's first comprehensive plan was adopted, we were assuming we'd try to make sure we add at least 10% reserve in the capacity calculations. That was proving difficult to maintain, so in 1998 we modified that to having it be within capacity, volume capacity ratio less than 1.0. Also threw in some additional provisions that at signalized intersections specifying a cycle length of 120 seconds. And the intent of that really was trying to make sure that, because if you slightly increase the cycle length, you can get just a little bit more capacity out of an intersection. But pretty soon you start chasing your tail with that. And we didn't want to get into a point of saying, well, gee, if we increase it to 160, 180, 240, pretty soon we're at 5-minute cycle lengths and people get really angry with that. So wanted to avoid that. Another thing that we looked at was when we get to establishing HOV lanes, that it's not just about moving cars, it's about moving people. And so we would measure it in part based on the person delay if those HOV facilities were there. So we're going to have to make assumptions about how many people are in buses and carpools, try to measure that where we can, but we can't always measure it exactly, and factor that in. So anyway, the way we're calculating this right now is we use a travel demand model, and I'll describe a little bit more about this. We use the forecast out of that travel demand model to generate future traffic volumes, and then capacity analysis software to convert that to the level service and volume capacity ratios. So the way the travel demand forecasting model works is, first off, we lay out within the software what the major street network looks like. We then program in what the land uses are and that defines how much traffic is generated within a specific area. We then calibrate the model to match the volumes that we're actually experiencing. Then we use land use forecasts, and this starts off all the way at the state Office of Financial Management and comes to Puget Sound Regional Council. Then that filters down to the local agencies, and then we try to figure out how we're going to fit everything within consistent with the zoning of the land. So we have these 2040 forecasts that were developed, and using that process, the assumption is that Federal Way will have 25,000 more people living within the city, and that's within existing boundaries, not including the potential annexation area, and 20,000 more jobs than we do currently. The 20,000 more jobs is about 80% more jobs than we currently have within the city. Population is about 28%, something like that. And in context of the entire region, we're talking about increasing the population by 1.5 million to about 5 million within the 4 counties, and 1 million more jobs. That generates a lot more traffic, and the assumption is by 2040 we're only going to add about 5% more lane capacity in that time frame. So real mismatch. So anyway, the model then outputs these future traffic volumes, which then we try to correlate into what the turning movements are at specific major intersections. So some of the other assumptions that are in that model is that, and this is Puget Sound Regional Council adopted policy language in the 2040 plan, is that transit service will double from existing conditions. The light rail will be completed between Seattle and Tacoma. We would have the largest percentage of growth contained in the designated urban and manufacturing and industrial centers. So ideally, most of the growth would occur in these dense areas, and city center is one of them. We also have major highway projects completed, such as the extension of 509 that we were talking about earlier, the extension of 167 from Puyallup to the Port of Tacoma, hot lanes on I-5, that's high occupancy toll lanes like we have on 167 right now, and will soon be on 405 from Bellevue up to Linwood. The Triangle project would be completed. We would have a new access to I-5 at 324th Street. And all the existing projects on our current transportation improvement plan would be completed. So, despite all that, the vast majority of trips will still be using cars. I mean, right now we've got about 3.5–4% of all trips being on transit. Even if we double transit service and we get up to 8%, that's still not a big swing. There's not a lot of new lane capacity being proposed on regional freeways, and that will spill over onto city streets. And to try and put that into context, when we have a major incident on I-5, say in Tacoma, where several lanes are blocked, and what happens to Federal Way in those instances will become an everyday occurrence without significant investment. How bad is that? Each one of these dots represents an intersection that will be over capacity by 2040 if we don't invest significantly more money in. And, you know, ultimately, it's not really sustainable. So, should we keep up? Both the City Incorporation and the Growth Management Act passage occurred because people were frustrated about the pace of development in the late 80s and not keeping up.
Rick, can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yeah.
Does that anticipate full build out of the light rail?
Yes, well, to Tacoma.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, probably Lakewood as well.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Our past surveys of the public in previous budget cycles always identified transportation as a top priority, pretty much on pace with police. and regional surveys have consistently identified transportation as the most critical regional problem. So the Growth Management Act and the existing language in our comprehensive plan looks at 4 basic options. One is you increase your level of funding for transportation, or revise land use assumptions to lower travel demand, or revise your prioritization process to fund capacity needs over safety and non-motorized and other potential needs, or you lower your level of service standard to meet available funding. Now, historically, and this language is also currently in the comprehensive plan, if you revise your land use assumptions, it becomes inconsistent with the goals and policies pertaining to urban centers, which city center is one of them, and potentially limits economic development. And furthermore, even if you did that, you can't control traffic from outside the city. So still failure of DOT to widen I-5 is going to create spillover traffic. So option 2 was revising capital project prioritization, reduces the funding for safety improvements and non-motorized transportation. It's inconsistent with other goals and policies already, and would still be inadequate to address the level of funding needed to maintain adequate capacity. So if you revise the level of service standard to meet available funding, you're potentially impacting roadway safety. When I first got here, almost all of our level of service failure intersections were also high accident locations. And we've done a really good job of addressing those. Adversely impacts air quality. If people are sitting there just idling in traffic, that can create a lot of hot spots for air quality. And then finally, buses can't move any better if traffic's not moving. So it impacts transit operations as well. And even if you're doubling the transit service, you're still trying to maintain adequate bus headways. You're going to need more buses out on the road. So the current comp plan language actually says improvement of funding in transportation appears to be the most realistic alternative. Well, there's some pretty significant trade-offs with that. So this map shows the extent of improvements that would be necessary. Now, you saw the red dots before. This is just showing the roadways that would need additional through lanes. That's what the green is. And that's on top of, this doesn't include places where you'd need to widen just to put in two-way left turn lanes, like on 288th, for instance. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris now and talk about the extent of the problem and what we can do about it. But as a starting point, this is the intersection of 23rd and 320th as it is existing, and how many lanes would be needed to be added to make that intersection work within our current level of service standard. So, Chris.
Thanks, Rick. My name is Chris Breiland. I'm a transportation engineer with Fehr and Perez. We're working with Rick and Sarah here on your transportation element update. And so this image here really kind of, in a nutshell, highlights the issues of, you can expand and provide the level of service that's necessary, but it comes down to the trade-offs and whether or not that's acceptable. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about level of service options that other cities here in the region have taken, and a lot of the issues focus on an issue like this is, are those trade-offs what you want to do for your community? What does that look like? So future growth results in additional traffic, as Rick was mentioning, and we just showed you sort of the widening that would be needed to accomplish that. And there are reasons that in places you might want to widen a street, but when you're doing that, you have to weigh the considerations of how much right-of-way are you taking up to do that. And in an area like City Center, where there's a lot of economic development proposed and ongoing in the area, how much land are you going to devote to that versus economic development? There's costs. If there's already land uses there, you have to purchase those lands to do that. How does it affect the pedestrian environment as an urban center? That's something that's PSRC and other organizations will want you to consider, and that's something important that we've talked to with city staff as well. Signal timing gets to be an issue. The bigger the intersections get, the more time you have to devote for traffic, for pedestrians to cross the signal. It's already an issue in city center. And urban form. What is the character, community character of that of the area that you're looking for? And these are the issues that many cities are grappling with and have grappled with when they're looking at, well, what do we do about this level of service standard and the requirement for transportation concurrency? You have to weigh those pieces all together. So I'm just going to talk about a few communities around the region. There's a whole bunch of options. I'm going to highlight mostly the larger communities, and I can talk about these more if you have any questions, but I'm going to focus on these here, and I'm going to talk about sort of what we have here in Federal Way, sort of an intersection level of service that Rick described. It's a uniform standard. Federal Way has that policy. Other cities have a flavor of that where they exempt intersections, and you're going to hear me say exempt quite a number of times through this presentation, where cities have consciously said, for a variety of reasons, we are going to allow in the peak period more traffic, traffic congestion at an intersection. We're going to accept that in trade-off for keeping it more compact, or the cost is just too high to have improvements there. We're going to look at some other options that look at area averages, and I'm going to focus specifically on Bellevue, since City Center and downtown Bellevue have some characteristics in common, but Kirkland also has that approach. Corridor average intersections, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but Kent and Tukwila have that option. Probably the most common in the region when you add some of the other cities. And then what Tacoma and Seattle do, just as an example, even though they're both sort of considering that screen line target that they have as well. So let me sort of talk a little bit about what some of this means. Rick went through as how Federal Way calculates its level of service, but in a nutshell, you calculate operations at every single intersection. Some of the pros are that it's pretty easy to understand for the traffic engineering community. We all kind of are familiar with that. It's easy to calculate, can be done pretty readily. A con is that any standard or any intersection that exceeds a standard requires some sort of mitigation. If you're over the standard, as Rick said, unless you're going to deny development, you have to do something about it, provide more capacity. And this is where some cities have exempted intersections. For example, Issaquah, that I listed before, has said, we're going to take this approach and exempt 6 intersections around the city. The 6 intersections that they've exempted all happen to be right adjacent to the freeway, because WashDOT generally is controlling what's going on there, and they've said we can't get these intersections any bigger for impacts and for costs. Once you get near the freeway, it gets very expensive to do anything. So they said level of service is not a consideration for concurrency or our planning at that point. They'll do everything they can outside of increasing the capacity at those exempted intersections, and quite a number of cities have taken that approach. An area-wide level of service standard, I highlight Bellevue here. They have 14 what they call mobility management areas across the city. And what they do is they look at intersection level of service, as we described before, but they average it across that entire area. And the idea is that they want to maintain reasonable traffic circulation within, again, the PM peak hour throughout an area, but acknowledging that in some cases there's going to be congestion and people will need to work their way around it, or their city is unwilling or unable to widen out an intersection. If you're next to a big development, you can't just widen the street and take out a large building. It's just not going to happen. So you can see in downtown, which I blew up there, 2 intersections there on Northeast 8th exceed the city's standard, but the average operations in the area are well within what they expect. And so that's an example of how that looks in that particular city. Some of the cons of that is that some folks have complained that, well, improvements to any intersection within an area can get you out of a level of service sort of jam, so to speak. And so developers sometimes say, well, I don't want to pay for improvements that aren't directly going to benefit me in front of my door. And so that's something that can be brought up. We tend to counter with that. Again, we're trying to improve mobility in a general area, so that's a fair use of of capital improvement dollars to make sure that an area generally works well. Corridor level of service, again, very similar to area, except you're looking at roads along. Does a stretch of road generally operate well? This is an example of Tukwila, South Center, urban growth area. Again, similarities to city center here. Lots of freeway issues, freeway traffic spilling over, only a couple of interchanges. A similar pro and con list, but the idea is that the city is willing to tolerate congestion at locations along a corridor so long as the corridor at large operates within the city's standard. It's something that a lot of people can grasp conceptually. And like I said, this is probably the most common sort of level of service method around the region. The last one I'll talk about more to sort of speak to one point is sort of this corridor screen line level of service standard. Tacoma and Seattle use something like this where they, again, measure volume to capacity ratios. It's easy to calculate, but it doesn't really identify projects. If you have a project that you'd like to implement that's not across a screen line, the screen line's not going to tell you that project has a tangible benefit. What I wanted to mention for Seattle's case is that their standards for level of service are essentially volume to capacity ratio of 1.2, or in other words, 20% more demand than there is capacity in the peak period. Why did Seattle do that? It's because they said we want to accommodate a lot of growth in an urban setting, and that results in congestion in the PM peak period. That's acceptable to us. Why I mention that is that the GMA says you have to define a level of service standard, but it's up to you folks to decide what that standard is, what's acceptable to your community. And that was done very intentionally so that communities can balance these things. The traffic flow versus the growth that the city needs to or wants to accommodate. And Seattle set theirs so that they wouldn't really have to think about this. And in some respects it shows. There's a lot of traffic there, and that's not what everybody wants. So that's the point that I wanted to make with that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Rick.
Thank you. So given that, we are looking at modifying the adopted level of service standard for signalized intersections only, and we would propose to go an area average of 10% over capacity within the city center area. And then outside the city center, we would allow individual signalized intersections to get up to 20% over capacity. Unsignalized intersections would still remain within capacity. And that's particularly because of the acute nature of if you've got, a stop controlled approach that is over capacity, you're going to have people taking really dumb risks. And I've actually documented the phenomenon. So that's where we're proposing to go with that. And this is an idea we haven't done real detailed analysis, but as you can see, there'd be a lot less failures, a lot less improvements necessary, and a lot less corridor widening that would occur under this proposal. The trade-off being, yeah, we're going to have more congestion as a result. So the next steps involved, we kind of got behind the 8 ball because Puget Sound Regional Council took over 3 years to come up with the growth forecasts, and we're madly trying to meet the legislative deadline of adopting the comprehensive plan by July 1. So, and Chris's firm has been instrumental in helping us meet that. So we're looking at providing the draft transportation element to the Planning Commission in early May. It will be to Land Use and Transportation Committee on June 1st and Council by the 16th. And that's the goals we're aiming at right now. And so really, this all boils down to, this is the direction we're heading in for now. So happy to answer any questions at this point.
I think we've got 2 comments, but I'll just start with my recommendation is based on, from what we're hearing, there's only so many lanes you could have at 320th 99. At some point, that it would just get to be so it would just be unpassable. And we also have to think about pedestrians and just quality of life in our community. So with that, Councilmember Honda, and then Councilmember Moore, and then Councilmember Selsky. I'm sorry, Councilmember Maloney.
It's fine.
Okay, Councilmember.
Okay, I know we're on a time crunch, so
Yes.
I just have a couple questions. One is, at this point, traffic, especially in the downtown core, is very crowded. I can watch emergency vehicles not get through intersections, especially Medic 1, because it's coming from across the bridge into Federal Way. And is there any way that we can fix that so that as traffic increases over time, we have a way that emergency vehicles can get through the intersections when they need to?
Okay, so it's, all of our signals have a system called Opticom that allows the emergency vehicles to get a green. The challenge is that there's all this traffic that needs to get cleared out in front of them. And so that can be a challenge. Beyond that, the other thing I mentioned is the idea of adding an interchange at 324th. That would essentially create another bridge across I-5 that would allow emergency vehicles to cross I-5 without having to deal with the gauntlet on 320th.
Okay, and I'll leave my other questions for later, but thank you very much.
Councilmember Moore.
And just some thoughts here and a question. I think under the mayor's proposal, does that address the concern that Councilmember Honda mentioned?
Only partially. I mean, there's only so much you can do at that point. And really, part of it is about training drivers to actually be alert when they see or, see the flashing lights and hear the sirens to get the heck out of the way, which doesn't always happen.
And my other thoughts here, and I'm really, I have to say this, I'm really happy that we're talking about this, because I know that you and I have met, and I've met with the mayor in regards to traffic congestion. It's a gigantic issue. But when was the last time we help me out with the terminology, we re-signaled the lighting system?
Synchronized?
Synchronized, re-synchronized the lighting on 320th.
On 320th, it's been about 2.5, 3 years now.
Okay. And my last question, Rick, is so Bellevue's system that they have in place, their technology, I think it's called mobility something. But what's the chances of working that into the comprehensive plan long term?
Well, yes.
Couldn't that be a long-term solution?
Well, it certainly helps manage it better. But, one of the reasons we have long had the volume capacity ratio 1.0 is when an intersection's over capacity, you can minimize delay, but you're still going to have what we call cycle failures that not everybody gets through in one cycle. And so then the queues tend to build back. And, we see that on 320th, particularly every Friday night, more so in the summer, that we just can't clear them out. And it doesn't matter how good your signal timing is, you're still not going to be able to clear them out. But certainly in terms of mitigating it to the extent possible, yes, a more sophisticated signal system would improve it.
Just real quickly, to follow up on Councilmember Honda's question, are you hearing from emergency medical personnel that they're having difficulty getting through the intersections?
Actually, no, we haven't been hearing that. I think, I guess I won't
right.
speculate.
Would you do us all a favor, reach out to the medic folks, the fire department folks, and ask that question?
Sure.
And let me know, and we'll make sure the council gets that information. I had not heard that, and so I want to make sure that if that's the case, I want to address it. All right, thank you. Councilmember Selsky and then Councilmember Maloney.
Yes, thanks, Mayor. Hey, Rick, thanks for the presentation. Just a question about one specific intersection, 336th and 21st.
Yes.
I think we just spent $1.5 million thereabouts to improve the capacity of that. Are we, with that improvement, are we at a VC of 1.0, or do you know offhand?
Currently, right now,
Yes.
we're at about 0.78.
Okay, so with that as a starting point going forward, I saw a red dot on that
Yes.
intersection and a long green line coming from Hoyt.
Okay, the long green line from Hoyt is the need, it's currently actually on the TIP to widen it to 5 lanes.
Okay.
So that project's already planned.
Okay, does most of the use of that road, I think, comes from northeast Tacoma.
A good chunk of it does.
Is there any way we can recoup some funding from our friends to the west
Well,
for that?
We have a long and colorful history with Tacoma on that topic. We have had developer mitigation that helps contribute to that, and the most recent one actually set a court precedent in Pierce County that allows us to do that explicitly. But even with developer mitigation, it still tends to be a drop in the bucket because, you know, if you get 5% of a project funded out of developer mitigation, you're probably doing pretty well. And, you know, and when you're talking, you know, that project is $17 million is our current estimate on that. And that's planning level. It may actually be higher when we get to final design. So, you know, right now I think we've got about $250,000 in mitigation towards that project. So we got a ways to go. And State Environmental Policy Act about how you collect mitigation tends to restrict our ability to get projects fully funded that way.
Probably hardly worth the effort, I hear. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll hold my questions for the Land Use Transportation Committee meeting.
Council, any other questions on this matter? We sure? Want to make sure there are no other questions before we recess. All right, we are recessed to executive session until the beginning of the city council meeting. I think, well, there's one matter we've got to get to.